Hello, everybody. It is Saturday night at 9 o'clock. This is Starfleet Tactical. I am Chris Weave, not speaking for my employer. So in any event, that timing was great, Lissa. That timing was great. I started the sentence, and before I got to like the third word, she went ahead and popped it out. So tonight we're going to be talking about Albedo, which is an interesting RPG that is my favorite train wreck. So we'll go ahead and talk about that tonight. And I talked with Pat Doyle earlier in the week. He's been flying his skybus all over. He had just gotten back from like a really, really obnoxious 2 weeks on the road sort of deal. So he's been doing that. But let's see. Let me go ahead and pull up the slides. And I'll go ahead and start. I forgot to delete Alec from the thing. I made a last second change to the slides. I went, oh, I forgot to change the title slide, but then I forgot to delete Alec from that. Alec is not going to be part of this tonight. I don't think Alec has even heard of Albedo. I think I asked him about it, and he has not heard of this. So, but I think some of the rest of you probably have. So go ahead and put questions in as I go along, and I'll periodically go and look at questions. And we'll have a little bit of a discussion, probably. So this is the first of 2 sessions I'm going to do on this. Next week, not next week, a couple of weeks from now, I'll probably do the second session, and then I'll end up doing Outsider. And I added Jovian Chronicles to the list. You can see I can't count because it says next 3 to 5 topics, and I've got about 12 topics there. But that's because they all seem to go together. Albedo goes together with the Outsider, which goes together with Jovian Chronicles. All of them have, Albedo has a heavy ship design element, so does Jovian Chronicles. Outsider has a jump drive that's very similar to the Albedo jump drive, but very interestingly different. And so I want to do the contrast and compare because, like I said, they're very similar, but they're very different. But none of this is going to happen the next couple of weeks, because I'm going to be out of town. So I'm unavailable on both the 8th and the 15th. And then hopefully the way this works is that, on the 22nd, I'll do the second Albedo run. On the 1st of March, I'll do the Outsider run, and then Jovian Chronicles when I get back after that. And then hopefully I'll finally be able to dive into Traveler Navies and history of ship types and stuff like that. So that's the plan going forward. Now, I'm going to show you a lot of artwork this time. I'm going to show you a lot of artwork the next time. The purpose of showing you this artwork is because, first of all, I think it's kind of cool, but it's also worth critiquing a little bit. So we'll critique it as we go along. The author of a lot of this stuff, the authors are still alive. They may not agree with some of the interpretations I have with all of this. So keep that in mind. None of this is intended to infringe on anybody's copyright. In fact, if anything, I wish it was in print so I could tell you to go buy it.
Actually, I just found it on Drive-Thru RPG. You can buy it for $5.
You can buy. I'm not sure if you can buy all of it, but you can buy a bunch of it.
You can at least buy some of it.
Yeah, you can at least buy some of it. So the first and second edition are pretty much the same, except that they're packaged differently. The third edition is called Platinum Catalyst. It's done by a different company, and it made some changes. And then there's a miniatures game that I just discovered within the last month or so. That's just solely a 28 millimeter miniatures game, and it doesn't involve starships at all. So I'm not really going to talk about that tonight. Okay, so here's the agenda. First, I'll tell you what it's about. I'll talk a little bit about the sources. I've mentioned some of those. I'll sort of give you just a general overview and sort of the approach of all of it. Do a little bit of background about the setting itself, but I'm not really going to get into that a whole lot. Talk some about tactical combat, then we'll dive into ships. Now, the deck plans, jump drive, strategic combat stuff, not going to get to tonight. I expect to get through all the ship type stuff, but maybe not. So somewhere in there's going to be a break, and I'll leave the rest for next week. Now, to the right, we see a ship design that I'm not really going to go into. This is the Aerodyne. It's a vertical launch, generally single stage to orbit, also does close air support. Think the drop ship from Aliens, and you got a pretty good idea of what you're talking about here. In the background, they do have some aerodynes that are capable of interplanetary travel. There's even some that are capable of interstellar travel. All of those are a really, really bad idea for reasons that the book itself explains why it's a bad idea, but they say that people do it. This is foreshadowing. There's a lot of inconsistency in this background, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. So what is Albedo? Well, Albedo is a game system based on the Irma Felda EDF section of the Albedo Anthropomorphics comic. So that was Steve Gallicci drew Irma Felda, and then he also had some other artists who drew the other two parts of that book and put them together. Albedo Anthropomorphics was the final product. They were later republished, some of them bundled as Command Review, just the Irma Felda portions. There was another spinoff called Birthright that I've never seen. I think there was one other one-off thing that was going to be a new series. I really wish Gallicci would just get together and come up with like a PDF that we could buy that would have all the stuff together for all the Irma Felda stuff. Now, I'll talk about this a little bit on the next slide, but this is a furry thing. We'll get to that in the next slide. I'm not really talking about the comics tonight. I'm really talking about the two RPGs. I'm not even really talking about Albedo Combat Patrol. So the two RPGs come in a first and a second edition that was done by Thoughts and Images, which is Gallicci's company. And then there was the Platinum Catalyst and Structural Integrity, which were separate standalone volumes that were done by another company. And so I happen to have visual aids. So there's Platinum Catalyst and Structural Integrity. The first edition was a box set. The second edition that had multiple volumes in it, two main volumes and then some like ship forms and stuff. Second edition was just one volume like that. And then there was also some supplements that came out for like the first and second edition. I don't know if there was any difference in the game in the first and second edition. I think it was mostly about how they packaged it. But you know, I didn't actually play the game, so I didn't notice really anything about the background or anything else like that that seemed to change. So that's a side view of an aerodyne, giving you an idea of how big it is. So here's the main sources that I'm going off of. And like I said, it's a furry thing. In fact, Steve Gallicci in an interview basically said that, you know, there had been sort of furry stuff, but he was part of the group that sort of made it all happen, you know, sort of pulled it. I think it was at a World Con in like 1980 was sort of the time period where all the furries sort of came together, and it was sort of like the first furry meeting or something to that effect. I'll take his word for it. I'm not really a furry guy. Yeah.
You know, given the furry hackers that were whistleblowers this past year, this does not surprise me somehow.
Furry hackers?
You didn't hear about that. I'll send you stuff later. Yeah.
Okay.
So
right.
essentially, this is just historic precedent for things that have happened.
All right. Sounds good. So the three main sources here, there's the role-playing game itself that's got a lot of background stuff, etc. The ship source book has deck plans and sort of ship design philosophy and how the jump drive works. That was originally in an article in a magazine called Vortex, which is a short-lived RPG magazine, but I happened to catch the jump drive and Albedo article because I was already an Albedo fan when that magazine came out. I ran into it in the local game store. Then for the ship source book, they just took the article and plopped it in the ship source book. And then the Drift is an adventure about a ship that's been very badly damaged. And I'll show you some illustrations from all this stuff. Yeah, Wright says that the thing is that the aerodyne is basically the V-22 of the universe, and that's true. It's basically there isn't really a whole lot of separate airplane stuff. That's really kind of where it's at. Now Wright also asked the question, any chance to get John Partial on the show? John has said he's willing to do it. So I just want to one of the things that happens with things like that is it involves, anytime I want to do something like that, it basically means I get to go and do some background research. And I really, really want to reread John's book before I have him on and think about the approach, because he's not somebody who generally talks about science fiction. I need to get a good idea about how much science fiction background stuff he has. Just like he's also not really a war gamer, although he's played war games. And so I want to make sure, this is the thing about having anybody on. You don't want to just have them come on and say, "Oh, tell me about your stuff," right? So it involves a little bit of work, and I just haven't had the time to do it yet. Okay. So next thing is, the approaches and the overview. So generally the approach of this game, this is both my approach to it and their approach to it. I'm looking solely at the games, and I'm mostly concentrating in the first 2 editions. There's some information I pull out of Platinum Catalyst. That's problematic because the Platinum Catalyst people were rewriting stuff left and right. It bills itself as being hard science, and it is, but not as much as you might think. It looks harder than it is, in that, no artificial gravity, but their fusion engines are magic. And there's just other things where it's like, I don't believe the numbers. Don't believe the numbers. They're using the right words, magic capabilities, but no magic words is how I phrase that. And there's a curious lack of spin sections. None of these ships have any sort of rotating sections to provide gravity. And that's largely because they just assume they're going to be under magically high levels of thrust all the time. And so they don't need a spin gravity section. Now, there's problems with that. There's real problems with that. Starting with, even if you can do magic levels of thrust all the time, you don't always do that. For instance, maybe you're in orbit, or maybe you're in patrol in a situation where you don't want the giant drive flare showing up, or you don't need it because I generally need to be in this area, so thrusting at 1G is actually counterproductive to my mission. In situations like that, you would expect there to be some sort of spin section to provide artificial gravity. They don't have any of that. Now, we are talking about genetically engineered furry creatures, so maybe they don't have the same problems with artificial gravity that we do. The series really, the games really suffer from some consistency issues. For instance, in the ship source book, the same 3 paragraphs appear in 2 places, 2 pages apart. It's clear that at some point he decided to move it, but he forgot to delete it from the original place. There's stuff like that all across the board. How things are described isn't always consistent. For instance, you'll see, if you look at the illustration on the right, which you'll see later again also, that there's sort of an opening in the middle. There's this central core access tunnel that is described in the text and is in this illustration, and it's never mentioned anywhere else, and it doesn't show up on any of the deck plans, and it doesn't show up in any of the other cutaways. So they specifically talk about it and about how that and the elevators are how you get from floor to floor, but then they don't do anything with it. It just disappears, right? Traveler has stuff like that too. There's at one point in Traveler Starship Operator's Manual by Digest Group, they talk about how there's this giant flywheel that they use to turn the ship, right? It's a momentum transfer device. They talk about this thing, and it's never been on any deck plans ever, including the deck plans in their book. So yeah, sure, giant flywheel, got it, right. The knowledge base of the writers is clearly not adequate to the task, and I'll point out some stuff later when I see it. But a lot of it's just they're using Navy terms, but they really don't understand how navies work, and they don't really understand how combat would work and how to put all this stuff together. Now, in their defense, remember, this is, or as I'm going to explain, this is a background that's totally divorced from our background. So they don't have any carryover traditions. Like one of the comments was made in one of the books in the background that they don't have any obsolete standards, right? There's no equivalent of, yeah, this like AM radio, right? There's no equivalent of AM radio, right? Yeah, it should have gone away, but it's what we used to use, and so we still kind of use it. No, all the standards are modern because there's no history there, and I'll explain that in just a second. Platinum Catalyst, there's lots of things that Platinum Catalyst just throws out, just ignores the stuff that came before, and they do their own, UBU guys, and they sort of did their own version of it. The ship artwork is also surprisingly minimalist for something based on, something where all the artwork is done by the original comic artist. A lot of the artwork you see is surprisingly minimalist. Like this one is not. The artwork here is fantastic on this particular piece. This is probably the best piece of artwork having to do with the internals of the ship that you'll see in the entire thing. So, okay, so let's talk a little bit about the background. So on the world of Eris Chakas, about 200 years ago, in the time of from when the Irma fell in the EDF section has taken place, the population suddenly becomes aware of this mystery, and that is none of them can remember back more than about 20 years, and nobody has any innate knowledge of what the history of their civilization is. It's just like, hey, where do we come from? Do you remember where we come from? I don't remember where we come from. Nobody has any. They're on this technological society. They got a worldwide internet sort of thing, et cetera, et cetera. They don't know where they came from. There's 150 sentient species on this world, and they understand that there's when they do the genetic analysis, all of a sudden, it's like, hey, we got to figure this out. Everybody sort of comes to this realization at once. We got to figure this out. And they go down that path, and they realize that there's some genetic similarities between them, but the native species on the planet, there isn't any genetic continuity there. So it's like something's going on. So where did this fully developed technological society come from? There's a short story that I can't find that actually gives you some hints of that. And later on in the comic, they find there was this hypothesized race of creators that put them on this planet. And they find a ship of the creators. In case you haven't figured out, there's going to be spoilers. They find a ship of the creators, and they have these weird primate bipeds on board, and technology way more advanced than what they have. But that ship got whacked, and it's been destroyed for a while, and everything's sort of mummified from the vacuum and stuff like that. And so there's no answers there. The Albedo comic ran from 1983 to 2005. In 2005, Steve Galactica and his wife discovered that she had cancer that turned out to be terminal. She died 2 years later. He basically stopped everything he was doing to take care of his wife, and he's never gone back to it. He said that he's got some thoughts, and he's not averse to the idea of going back to it. He just hasn't gone back to it. I hope he does go back to it at some point. He still does artwork. He still sells backstock. He still goes to cons and stuff like that. He just hasn't produced anything new. So in any event, going back to the folks on this planet, they decide to build a space-going capability to go look for the creators. And as it turns out, when they go poking around on their global information network, everything they need to build up their technology to get to the point where they can develop that space-going capability is there. They've got all the answers. It's not all in one place. There's no place that says, open this folder to figure out how to build a spaceship. But everything they need is there, and they don't know where that information came from. But they start building spacecraft. They start building colony ships. They eventually develop a jump drive, and they go off and they settle other worlds. One of the groups that gets settled is a group of racist expansionist rabbits that form the Interstellar Lapine Republic. And so that's the Latin word for rabbit. And so you've got these basically neo-Nazi rabbits, which is entertaining in its own way. And the end result of those folks starting the first Lapine War is that the Confederation, the other powers come together and they form the Confederation, and the Confederation forms the Extraplanetary Defense Force in response to all of that. EDF is kind of interesting. EDF is the international force. It is the space-going force, and it has basically lightweight marine forces. All the heavyweight stuff is with units called the Home Guard, and Home Guards are specific to all the member worlds. So this planet has a Home Guard, and that planet has a Home Guard. And they generally kind of follow EDF standards, but not totally. And they're the ones that have like lots of tanks and stuff like that. The EDF is a much more lightweight force. In all honesty, when I read it, what I think of is the Weimar Republic. I'm sorry, not the Weimar Republic. Thing before the Weimar Republic, the German Empire, the Kaiser Wilhelm's Reich, which lasted from 1870 whatever until 1918. And that's because in that particular polity, the Navy was the national force. It was the Navy was common. You were a member of the German Navy, but you were actually a member. If you were in the army, you were in the Prussian army or the Bavarian army or whatever. In fact, if you look at German military uniforms from World War I, if you know what you're looking for, they look different. They're all they all have the spiky helmet. That was a Prussian innovation. They all have some other things in common, but they had national forces, of which the Prussians were like 70% of the army, because the Prussian army was just the biggest. So, so Lissa says, wasn't there a Scarlett Johansson movie about that? I'm not getting the reference. So be more specific, Lissa. Be more specific.
I don't remember the name of the movie. I'm looking it up right
now. Okay. She'll come back and be more specific. Yeah, Bob points out that the Epstein drive in The Expanse is a magic drive also. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Very much so. Okay. I'm only going to talk about tactical space combat very briefly, because there's a little bit of it, but we don't have a really good view of it, and it's got some problems, and it's an RPG combat system. So you can't, the way it's gamed out is very much of an RPG system. But here's the essential points of this. You've got things like high velocity slug throwers, chain guns, relatively small caliber slug throwers, and lasers. But those things function mostly as point defense weapons. They're mostly about taking care of ordnance that's incoming at you. Ships are generally pretty well armored. And armor is very, very big deal in this universe. The comments made that basically for tanks, there really isn't anything man portable that can take out an armored fighting vehicle in this universe, unless you get exceptionally lucky. You basically need a vehicle-mounted weapon to do that. Incidentally, the guns are liquid propellant. They're not like cartridge-cased solid propellant systems like we have. Like, there's no gunpowder, it's liquid that allows them to adjust the velocity and do a bunch of other things with that. The main ship-killing weapon is something called an autonomous combat vehicle, or ACV, which is what they use to attack planets with. It's what they use to attack other ships, and I'll point them out when we see them in a later illustration. That was basically a derivation of their message torpedoes, their message things that they use to send messages in between star systems. But they're pretty good-sized weapons. Combat's not a surprise, because you spend months going across the system trying to get from one jump point to another jump point. It's really kind of inconsistent as to how long it takes. But they say, a month is not unreasonable. 2 weeks is generally about as fast as it gets. Big magic fusion torch, you're going to see this thing coming. This isn't really a system where you have a lot of stealth. Generally, the combat ends up taking place in the form of a high-speed pass, although they do have a specific term. I think they call it an encounter, for when you sort of end up on generally the same vector and maybe you get to slug it out a little bit. Combat is largely managed by the AI system. So basically, the humans are there to sort of do all the tactical stuff and programming the AI combat system to actually execute when they get close enough to shoot each other, and then to do damage control afterwards. That's what you have people for. That also sort of explains why you have really, really small crews, and I'll talk about the small crews in just a moment. Okay, here's a look at some of the ship types you see. And you'll see that, basically that big ship at the top and the smaller ship at the bottom are almost all exactly the same size. And so why is that? And then one of the things they talk about is that as ships get bigger, the diameter to length ratio generally shortens a bit, because you end up with, if you were to keep that ratio, as you're increasing the size, the volume is increasing greater than the surface area, and you eventually get to the point where if you do it wrong, you don't have enough fusion engines to move it, and so generally you don't want the mass to increase as much, so you shorten the ship, relatively speaking. That collar that you see about a quarter of the way back from the end, that's where the fusion drives are, and they're basically there's several rings that they're basically linear things that are mounted parallel to the side of the ship, and there's a bunch of them going around, and there's some flaps there that give them the ability to deflect their thrust in various directions. The jump drive is powered off of magneto-hydrodynamic accumulators that basically pull power out of the thrust. They make the comment about how you can be ready to jump faster the faster the ship is going. Okay, but you also told me it's going to take 2 weeks. So is that really an issue? Is the speed of the ship really an issue if it's going to take me 2 weeks minimum to get to the next jump drive? This is one of these places where they're not very consistent. They say things, everything they say at just like that at this sentence level makes sense. It's when you start comparing the sentences from various parts of the book that it doesn't make sense. I think the problem is for the first and second edition, I'm not positive, but I think Paul Kidd, the author, did like 90% of the work. I think he had a little bit of extra help. Steve Galactica did the artwork, but Paul Kidd, I think, did about 90% of the work. And I think that's a problem. And remember when I said the artwork isn't that impressive? Here's an example of artwork that just not really looking that impressive. Oh, by the way, the thing on the far right-hand side is a heavy lift booster. So that has an air-breathing fusion engine on it. And it's basically built out of the same kind of parts, but it's just smaller. And it's a surface-to-orbit heavy lift booster. Okay, moving on. Oh, and you see that there's little tiny numbers there that tell you that these are certain diameter. When we get to the deck plan section, I'm going to show you deck plans of those various diameters. Okay, so various ship types. Now, the chart on the top is ship types, and that comes from the ship source book, if I remember correctly. And the chart on the bottom is from Platinum Catalyst, and I'll tell you right now, they don't match. There's some important differences there. So going through the list, you have a frigate at 20,000 tons, but it's only got a crew of 12. Remember that illustration I showed you? I'm going to show you again. You've got big fuel tanks at, in fact, let me go back to it real quick. Big fuel tanks at the top, they're sort of grayed in. Big fuel tanks at the bottom. You can see the baffles in there. And then the people section's kind of in the middle. So you got fuel tank, engineering section, people section, fuel tank, with sensor clusters at the front and the back. We'll go over that a little bit more later. Okay, so frigates have a crew of 12 and are about 20,000 tons. Escorts about 40. And frigates are the smallest true starship. Now, that illustration I just showed you previously is called Small FTL Scout. I guess that's a frigate. Small FTL Scout is a word that's not used anyplace else except for one other illustration in the original rule book that sort of had its silhouette in the background, or that one was labeled Small FTL Courier, if I remember correctly. So they throw out these terms and then they just disappear. Escorts are about 40,000 tons, about twice the size, with a crew of 16. and they are described as reasonable fighting power on a ship on a cheap hull. Destroyers are a little bit bigger, quarter bigger, with 20 people, and light cruisers are 80,000 tons. So you got a big jump up to light cruiser, but only 4 more people. And they talk about flotilla leader of small task force. We'll talk about that when we get to the stuff on the bottom. Then you've got cruisers at 100,000 tons and very large command carriers, which in the first and second edition are called something else, very large carrier and support vessel, I think. And then in Platinum Catalyst, they call them very large command carriers. First edition says 5,000 people, including apparently all the people that are on the carried craft, because it carries, like, basically it can carry an entire fleet around with it. But Platinum Catalyst describes them as having 10,000 people potentially. And they're up to 1 kilometer wide and 5 kilometers long, which is sort of interesting because the biggest hull you see before you get to those is like 80 meters. So they go from about 240 feet to 3,000 feet with no description of anything in between. Okay, I'll press the I believe button. Now, when you get down to look at what the various task force groupings and type stuff are, so the carrier group, it says it's one very large command carrier plus a capital squadron. Yeah, you'd want to defend this thing, right? So you're going to have a squadron. So what exactly, be more specific, right? What exactly is a squadron? Well, a capital squadron is 2 ships plus a support vessel. So you're going to send the thing that's 5 kilometers long, has 5,000 people, has a factory on board. It can mine local resources. It's a command and control node. It has all these capabilities. You're going to send it out with 2 escort ships. And it talks in Platinum Catalyst about how, it goes and defends and it does this and it does this and it does the other thing. And it's 2 ships. Doesn't make any sense to me that you would have that. Task force is 1 capital ship. Now, I'll note the capital squadron, it does say 2 large capital ships, which is important because when you get down the capital ship, you find that any ship of a corvette size or bigger counts as a capital ship. What's a corvette? This is, as near as I can tell, the only place in the entire set where they mention the term corvette in any of the books. I don't think it mentions corvette in any place else. Patrol is basically like a fighter patrol. So this is consistent all the way through the books, is that you've got them tossing out terms that make perfect sense, except they don't make sense because they don't include anything else. It just misses the boat in anything involving consistency. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm talking about this because I love it. There's a lot of really, really cool things in here that I really, really love. Big fan of Albedo. Was very excited to discover that the miniatures game existed because it gave me another thing that had a bunch of background. I love the background, love a bunch of stuff. Oh, Wright points out the Kaisers were like they were the small ships, Liberty ship type things that were built to escort carriers to fill out the Navy. So yeah, they're kind of like that. Except they're purpose-built warships and they're 40,000 tons. They're huge. So I love this background and it's got a lot of cool stuff going for it, but it's really inconsistent and that's really, really painful. Okay, so let's take a look at ship design. So they talk about commonly for most ships, it's about a 1-to-5 ratio. Okay, so there we go. You've seen the illustration on the right-hand side. There's a simpler drawing on the left-hand side. You've got liquid hydrogen tanks fore and aft. You've got a ring of fusion engines sort of near the stern. Look at how long those fusion engines are. Now, I think there's some stuff there that includes the magnetohydrodynamic taps, and there's some steerage stuff that isn't just fusion reactor and magnetic nozzle. There's some other stuff in there, but take a look at those things. That's going to be important later. But one of the things they have is modular ship construction. So all those decks in the middle, the people decks, are all swappable. And they make it sound like they're pretty routine swappable. And there's a market in used decks, and for the bigger ships, for smaller ships like 20-meter ships, 24-meter ships, it's an entire deck. Then eventually you get to, with some of the bigger ships, the modules are half a deck, so you can mix and match half decks. And then when you get to the biggest ships, they're in pie wedges of a third of the deck, and so you can mix and match. So the stern is all one unit, the engineering system is all one unit, but when you get to the module section, the modules are sort of swappable at some level. Okay, so here's what the interiors look like. If you look on the right-hand side, what you see is that there's a floor, and then there's a space in between the floors. And it talks about how in that space in between the floors, you have all the life support gear, etc. You see some of that on the left-hand side. Underneath the floor, there's life support gear, etc. I'll come back to the illustration on the left in just a moment. And so if you look real carefully, it's hard, at least for me to see on this screen, but if you look up close, it looks like there is a deck that goes underneath that floor module. So like maybe there's like a pan that you put that module on. You pull the sides off, you slide it in, you mount it to the pan, and it's good to go at that point. So it at least appears to be consistent with the idea that these decks are modular. Now, on the in the left-hand side, you'll see that there's all that stuff under the floor. One of the things they talk about is that the racks, the bunk system, is basically an emergency life support situation. So like if you're in combat and you're in your rack, when the ship depressurizes or something, there's a suit in there for you, there's food and water, you can survive in your bunk for some period of time. This also explains one of the things, and I'll point this out when we get to the deck plans next week. One of the things that drives me nuts about Traveler deck plans, and what drives me nuts about the deck plans here, is that if you've got a stateroom that has it's a two-person stateroom, you see two beds. It's like, okay, there's this really cutting-edge technology known as the bunk bed that can allow you to save floor space by putting beds one on top of each other. But nobody in the science fiction world appears to have discovered that. At least the people who do deck plans do not. Now, in Albedo's defense, this would explain why they don't, right? Because there's a bunch of life support gear there. There may be some other storage there as well. And so like if you go, okay, that's a self-contained unit, no, that just sort of is the way it is, and that's a crew safety thing, and that's what the standard is, I get it. I could also see a situation where the reason why you don't have, like in Traveler, why you wouldn't have that is that there's a desk underneath the bed. The bed's actually up high and there's a desk underneath it. Or in the case of, you might have storage either up or above, that's where a closet unit is. In the US Navy, the way that works is that like an officer might have a stateroom and he's got two beds of which he sleeps in one. And there are two desks in the room, of which one is his workstation. But the other bed is there in case you've got other people coming on board, because it's not like they have guest rooms. At least aircraft carriers actually have guest rooms. Smaller ships generally don't have guest rooms. Sometimes if they're under crewed, there might be some space available. But as a general rule, it's not like there's a hotel nearby. And so the way they do that is they have extra bunks available. I said something about that being their primary workspace for terms of U.S. naval officers, in terms of like doing all their paperwork, being a department head, etc. Their workspace when they're not out walking around is in their stateroom, and that's why it's not unusual on a destroyer or a cruiser. You don't see the name of the occupant; you see their job description. So we'll say like Chang for chief engineer, or it'll say WEPS or something like that, because he's got a secret level computer, he's got an unclassified level computer, that's where he works. The enlisted folk have a workspace. So like the weapons department has an administrative office space where they keep all the paperwork and stuff like that, because the enlisted folk do not have staterooms. So they need a workspace like that and a place to keep tools and things. So, whatever they need to keep there. The officer, on the other hand, he's not in that space. He's elsewhere. And that has, that lets the chief run his little domain and the officer not get in the way. The officer's busy doing paperwork. That works well. Okay, next slide let's take a look at this engine. You see a spacesuited figure with the top end of the engine, and then you see what the fully assembled thing looks like in the middle there. He's floating near the top. And so that's got the magnetic nozzle assembly. Now, the thing on the right is maybe the same scale, maybe not be the same scale. It is a message torpedo. It is a message, an autonomous message vehicle, basically. And the idea is it jumps to another system. And the way they describe it is like it's got a fusion drive and fusion fuel, and it's moving across the system to the jump point, and then it jumps, and then when it gets there, it docks and it unloads all of the most of what it's carrying is electronic data. Now, anybody who's a Traveler fan knows that this is like almost the right way to do it, that the right way to do it is to jump into the system and broadcast it out, especially in a system where where the way this jump drive works is that you're not jumping from random points. You're jumping from very specific points in the system. And so if I need to go from one system to another, I may have to go to the other side of the system. Maybe I'm lucky that the place I need to go to next is on my side of the system. The place geometrically where I need to be is on my side of the system. But usually I have to go some distance away. And so the right way to do this would be that it comes out and it broadcasts to the facility that's waiting on the other side, and it loads it onto a torpedo, and that thing takes off before this thing even gets docked. And you wouldn't have like one central depot for the entire system, but what they describe really sounds like one central depot for the entire system, which seems really inefficient to me. But I wonder if this magnetic nozzle if they're supposed to be the same size. They have a different number of bandings there. The sections are different size in terms of their length to width proportions. So, okay. The ACVs have to be pretty big because they've got a fusion engine in them, but it's unclear as to how big a fusion engine that is compared to what they've got. This has implications that I'll point out in a few minutes. But keep in mind that shape, because you're going to see that shape showing up in some of these illustrations. Okay, so this is what they look like under thrust. And this illustration on the right-hand side had always sort of baffled me because the ship doesn't look the same, right? It doesn't have that sort of cold capsule, capsule medicine look to it, in that it looks like it's got a lot blunter aft and then the front end. And I finally realized that that's because I'm watching a black and white image here. And what I'm seeing on the end of that is the fact that the drive flare is basically obscuring the stern of the ship. So you're not actually seeing the stern of the ship. The illustration on the left sort of shows what I mean. You've got this drive flare that's coming out of this band around that's about a quarter of the way up from the end, and it's sort of covering the rear there. And that's why you can't really see it. And oh, by the way, why would you mount your fusion engines in such a way that they're directly going to be putting like fusion exhaust on your cryogenic hydrogen tank? Why would you do that? I don't think I would do that. I think I'd put the engines at the very back. They look cool. They look really cool. I don't think it makes sense the way they've got it set up. Okay, and I also, like, you see that little thing that looks like it's retracted on the top illustration? There's no piece of gear that I've ever seen that looks like that in any of the other illustrations. It's like a one-off. Oh, I said I'd point out the ACVs. I think these are ACVs that we're seeing off to the side. I think those are autonomous combat vehicles. You can see that's got a big hatch, a couple of big hatches on the side there. I think it's popped out some autonomous combat vehicles, and they're probably just getting ready to accelerate or something. I don't know. It's tough to tell which direction this thing is actually moving in. The entire idea behind the ACVs is you don't want to be necessarily with the ACVs. You want the ACVs ahead of you so that they can take out the target without, and you can potentially use ACVs to intercept his ACVs. You want all that stuff going on ahead of you. You don't want to be in the middle of it when it's taking place. So this, it makes me think that this is like right at launch time. Okay, so let's take a look at a specific example. And this is the destroyer, the long endurance destroyer DH-160. This is all from The Drift, which is the third of the sources there. And on the right-hand side, you have what it looks like before it was in a battle. On the left-hand side, you see what it looks like after the battle. I'll note, it won the battle in that there are some people alive on this thing after all this has happened. The other ship was totally destroyed. But they had an ACV battle, and this is what ended up happening. So note on the right-hand side, you see those long thrusters, long fusion engines down in that cowl that goes around the side of the ship. But if you go over and compare it to the damaged ACVs on the left-hand side, there's a couple of things there. That cylinder approximately in the middle, that little cylinder is a damaged ACV. I kind of look at that. I look at the ACV decks and I go, that's not the right size to be one of those fusion thrusters. So they must be different sized fusion thrusters. They have to be. Are they supposed to be? Because when I kind of look at that message torpedo thing, it kind of looked to me like maybe they were trying to imply that they're the same. And they talk about being able to use one to sort of move the ship around. I need to go back and reread that passage and see if it has more size information that I missed the first time. But it kind of makes me wonder. This is actually a pretty good size ship. It's got a 40-meter diameter hull. That's pretty good size. It's got 18 decks, if I remember correctly. That's really good size. But it's 34,000 tons, which according to the chart makes it an escort, not a destroyer. And it's on the small side for an escort. A destroyer is like 50,000 tons, an escort's like 40,000 and below. And then whatever the frigate is like 20,000 tons. So it's like, okay, it's kind of small, but it's got a crew of 24, which puts it in the light cruiser category for crew size. It also talks about how it's a long endurance destroyer, but the text specifically says it wasn't really configured for long endurance. And it's like, okay, is it a long endurance destroyer or not? And it may be just that what they meant by that is like, okay, they didn't think the mission was going to be that long, so they didn't give it a lot of fuel, or they didn't give it a lot of supplies. They didn't fully supply it for a long mission. But then again, they talk about a minimum of 2 weeks to go between jump points, and it was sort of off on a patrol. So it's going from here to there to the other place, et cetera, et cetera. So if you figure it's a minimum of 2 weeks in between, and they talk about how it was only really configured for a month, it's like, okay, that seems, first of all, why wouldn't you configure it for the maximum capability? You might have, something might come up. And the second thing is you're telling me that everything is a minimum of 2 weeks apart and maybe a month apart, and then you're telling me that it doesn't have the endurance despite the fact it's a long endurance destroyer and it's a huge ship, relatively speaking. There's some information in there that should let me calculate as to whether 34,000 tons makes sense for that size ship. I just haven't had the opportunity to do it yet, but I'm going to go back through and do that, because it would not surprise me if those numbers didn't work either. Okay, so that's it for basically what I've got for now. I'm going to go through the questions and stuff. So if you got any questions, let me know. But next time I'm going to talk about the deck plans for this and the jump drive and basically the tactics about when you go into a system and how you defend a system, et cetera, because the jump drive really defines what you can have in terms of offense and defense. And so I'll get into that some. So let me go through and look at the chat. Bill Ricker says that the level of damage on the Victor explains a need for modularity. Yeah. Although I suspect that none of those modules are probably going to get recycled later on. And although, you know, the drift does show that there are some areas that weren't touched. Basically, they took an ACV hit that penetrated really deep inside, but it didn't get all the way to the bottom of that stack. It's unclear to me, since these are kinetic kill vehicles, it's unclear to me what blew off the stern. But there are modules that weren't totally destroyed. Incidentally, that ship was on a patrol to go to a system where in the first Lapine War, a battle had been fought, and the Confederation was going to build a base, so it drug all of the debris to one of the Lagrange points, and it also pulled in like a comet that they could mine for fuel. They could get the volatiles from that for fuel, and it brought all that stuff in. But before they had the chance to build the advanced base there, sort of the theaters of the war shifted. So all this, they basically swept up the debris of this battle so they could salvage it and sort of, you know, remanufacture some of the parts. And they've got this other stuff, you know, commentary mass there, but they didn't do anything with it. So these guys come into the system. They discover that there's a hostile force there. They beat, which is pirates of some sort that are using this area as a base. They beat that ship, and now they're very badly damaged, and they have to cobble something together to get to the area where all this stuff is, the drift, to try to put together enough stuff to at least, they figure at some point somebody's going to come looking for them. And if they can at least, you know, find enough supplies, they can last out. Maybe they can cobble enough stuff together that they can actually like repair the ship enough to make a jump. That would be interesting. But they don't know what's all there, so they have to go take an inventory of it. And so that's what all that was based on. So what about escape pods? They don't ever talk about escape pods, in all honesty. I think they exist, but I've never seen an illustration that shows them. Theoretically, they have some aerodynes there, and you could use those as escape pods. But they don't really talk about that. And, you know, if you've only got 24 crew, are you going to use a doctor for one of those spots? I think they probably have some sort of automated doctor facility, but they don't really talk about that a whole lot. It's one of the many things they don't talk about. Okay, scrolling back up. So Lissa asks, are we sure the artist wasn't just looking at a baby bottle while drawing the ship? Could be.
I actually figured it out. It's based on a Zeppelin.
Yeah, could be.
I think it's based on a Zeppelin because you mentioned how did you describe the rabbits? That it had me laughing so too hard. I can't remember.
Oh, like neo-fascist expansionist rabbit.
That.
Yeah.
That.
Yeah. Could be.
Because if that is actually how their delineation is in the book, I almost guarantee they were looking at a Zeppelin and trying to spacify it.
Yeah. I'm not the only guy who thinks this is cool. I think it was Rob Caswell. Rob Caswell is somehow associated. Now, Rob Caswell is a traveler artist. He did the deck plans for the Fiery, which is my all-time favorite ship. Which reminds me, one last thing before I go. I'm going to go and get some ship models and bring them over. We can take a look at them together. I think Rob Caswell was involved in that, and for the Starship Modelers website, which has got a lot of cool pictures of models. I sent him a note. This is like 20 years ago now. I sent him a note that said, wow, yeah, I love the logo for this site. I can tell that you must be a fan of Albedo because it's a ship from Albedo. Mm-hmm. And I refreshed the page like 20 minutes later, and the image had changed. And he sent me an email and I said, dude, did you change the image? And he said, yeah, I mean, I kind of like just basically stole the image from Steve Gallici. So I thought I should change it a little bit. But the first one, straight up an Albedo ship. To the best of my knowledge, there are no Albedo models. I've never seen an Albedo model.
I mean, if he's not making money off of because you said it was a 3D model, right?
No, it's just a drawing.
Oh, it's just a drawing. Oh, okay.
Just a drawing.
My bad. I thought you were talking about actually like 3D printed.
No, it's just a drawing. In fact, let me do a quick search. See, I haven't been to the site in a while. Yeah, if you go to the site, I'm not going to try to share it, but if you go to the site, the logo, that's the new version of it. It used to just be an Albedo ship. So just type in Starship Model or go to the site. There's a lot of really, really seriously cool pictures of various models and kit bashes and customizations and stuff like that. Bob says that he likes the back ring section. No reason the spacecraft should have a blind spot at the back. That's true. In fact, it's hard to tell on this, but there's actually a central corridor that goes in. It explicitly says that there's a sensor cluster at the top of the ship, at the bow, and at the stern. So there is a pile of sensors there with a trunk that lets you get to it if you need to get to it to do maintenance. And so now that if you're backing towards something and you've got a drive plume going, I suspect you can't see a whole lot through that drive plume anyway.
Like you might have sensors back there, but they're probably getting some sort of interference in some way.
Yeah, that's what I would expect. It's like putting a searchlight right next to the night vision goggles doesn't usually help.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, oh, one of these is canceling out the other.
Yeah. Now I suspect also that probably, in fact, I know this is the case because they say it somewhere in there, something to the effect of that the ACVs have, sensors, et cetera, and so they're getting a sensor feed from the ACVs. I believe I remember it saying it somewhere in there.
Yeah, it depends on the nature of the drive versus the nature of the sensors. I mean, that's fair, but usually speaking, even if it's like, because there's heat sources and like radio waves and things like that can be emitted from what you're doing just as a byproduct.
So by the way, I was just answering somebody, another friend of mine, saying, hey, did your Facebook get hacked? For those of you who are my friends on Facebook, I created a second Facebook page. That's an outward facing Facebook page. And then I'm making the personal one private. And so I did not get hacked. I really did create a second Facebook page. And I purposely called it Chris Weave instead of Christopher Weave. And I used different photos in the hopes that would clue everybody in that it wasn't just a clone page. But everybody's being very, very diligent about their information assurance training. So good for them. Good for everybody. So
hey,
going back here, did you ever figure out Jojo Rabbit? I don't know.
That was Jojo Rabbit.
I don't know.
It's a 2019 film by Taika Waititi. It's a little kid in a Hitler Youth whose mom has been hiding a Jewish girl in their attic, and it's like following the story of this kid.
Okay, I had absolutely no idea what that was about.
Yep, I've heard good things. I haven't sat down and watched it yet, but I've heard amazing things about it.
I'm a big fan of Scarlett Johansson. I really liked Lucy. And I also really, really liked now I'm drawing a blank. What's the one that she that everybody had the problem with them
Ghost in the Shell.
Yeah, Ghost in the Shell. I really like Ghost in the Shell.
So my thing with Ghost in the Shell is Makoto was like she was always a like a cybernetic being, and she's actually known for like even changing genders. Like it's like, oh, this body got damaged. All right, I'm gonna change my gender. Or literally at one point, she gets in a child's body. as like a disguise. So like she could literally be cast as anyone at any time. It doesn't matter the race, the age, whatever.
Yeah.
The reason why it's called Ghost in the Shell is because the ghost is like your spirit, your mental presence,
and she changes bodies.
and the shell is the body.
So I came away from that entire controversy going, look, movies cost godzillions of dollars. If the people putting up the money say, I want Scarlett Johansson or you don't get the money, then you get Scarlett Johansson.
Yeah. Well, and see, the thing is, for every other casting, it was fucking spot on.
Yeah.
Like, if you watch the anime, if you've read the manga, it's spot on for like the anime casting.
Yeah, and I can't remember, did they, when they went back and sort of showed her as a human before the transformation?
They did show that she was an Asian woman before she got transferred into the shell. So like,
I don't have a problem with that. So
it felt like a good way to integrate that into the storyline and acknowledge its origins, while also saying, hey, we have to have the star power.
I think they didn't do a good enough job explaining that, though. The fact that she's,
and that's the thing. If you hadn't watched the anime beforehand or had any sort of like knowledge of the media before, you might have been lost. But if you had watched it already, it felt like a love letter.
Something important ended up on the cutting room floor, I think.
I think so too. I really and truly think something got missed.
Okay, so we're at the hour mark. Let me do one quick thing, and then we can go. Or should I wait till next? No, I'm going to do the quick thing. 1 second.
And you're right, Olive. Okay. They could have done better, but I also understand studios are studios.
Yeah. I was going to do this last week, and right before we got on, I said to Alec, are you a fan of Traveler? And he said, what's that? And so the entire time that I was talking with Alec last week, I had a bunch of cool stuff sitting right next to me that I wasn't showing.
I'm sorry for not calling you out.
Thank you, dear brother. So I'm actually feeling great. Okay, so Lissa, I'm going to take you off so that I've got more screen real estate, or you can take you off. Okay, so my friend Brian Haven has been 3D printing ships. These are from Second Dynasty. This, of course, is an Empress Morava class Far Trader. It's a 300-ton. I actually have it all written down here. It is a 200-ton ship. So this 200-ton ship is the same size as other 200-ton ships because they're displacement tons. A ton is actually a measurement of volume. So this ship is 200 tons, as is this ship, which is a Beowulf class free trader. So as you can see, they are the same size. Okay, maybe they aren't the same size. Maybe this one's twice as big as the other one, at least in terms of the print. So this is a recurring theme with the Second Dynasty stuff, is that these all came as a package. They should have made them all the same size. Here we have a fiery class gun to escort. Now, this is one yet a new iteration of the fiery in that it doesn't have the integrated gig. It actually comes with a gig that it supposedly just attaches to the bottom and carries around with it. It in the Tom Peters illustration that defined this thing, it's actually slots in it's recessed, but in this one it is not. The Fiery class is a 300-ton ship. So this is a 200-ton ship. This is a 300-ton ship. Yeah, I don't think so. And this is a 400-ton ship. This is a Dragon SDB. And these are multiple pieces. I'm not quite sure. I'm not willing to try to pry them apart because I think they're some sort of tab thing and I'll break them if they do. But if you were assembling these, you'd probably want to glue them before you stick them together. This is a Gazelle class close escort, which is the non-streamlined version of the Fiery. And so in theory, the inside of this and the inside of this look the same. But as you can see, they are not the same length. So that's a little bit off, I think. All the other illustrations I show the floor plans to look pretty much the same. The difference is that this has drop tanks for extended jumps, and the Fiery actually just attaches. It doesn't have drop tanks. It has regular tanks, and so it can carry more fuel. And there's a couple of different versions of the ubiquitous Type S Scout, which is a 100-ton ship, if I remember correctly. Double checking. Yeah, Type S is 100 tons. But, you know, size-wise, it's really pretty close to that 200-ton ship. So, but that one, maybe I'll grant it. Maybe that one works. I'm not quite sure. There's another Type S Scout I'm not going to get out that is a slightly different size. So in any event, and if those of you who are into 3D printing and like traveler ships, this is what you can get. And they also come with some small models, like for instance, gaming size models. Here is the miniature Fiery, complete with a little hole to put a peg in it so that you can use it as a gaming miniature. So I need an entire fleet of these. And with that, I think we're going to go ahead and call it an evening. Once again, I am honored that we've got all these people here who are willing to spend their Saturday evening listening to me talk about starships and stuff like that. Next week, we will continue with Albedo. And hopefully you can come back, and I can thank you again next week for watching. We'll continue with Albedo. I'm going to talk about jump drive. I'm going to talk about deck plans and sort of show you how these things are set up. And then we'll talk about sort of the combat stuff that goes along with it. And in the meantime, thank you very much, everybody. See you next week.